Long before Florida was a peninsula, it was a piece of Africa. The bedrock under the state rifted away from that continent some 200 million years ago and drifted west, locked onto a different plate entirely. For most of the time since, it sat underwater as a shallow sea, building up the limestone that the whole state still rests on today. The shape on the map now, the one everyone recognizes instantly, only finished forming in the last few million years. What looks fixed and permanent from above is still, geologically speaking, brand new. Biscayne Bay is a beautiful, shallow lagoon stretching 56 kilometers long, located right next to the bustling city of Miami in southern Florida. It serves as an important maritime gateway and a premier tourist destination famous for luxury yacht cruises. To preserve nature, most of the bay's southern area is strictly protected within Biscayne National Park. This bay boasts a rich marine ecosystem with natural coral reefs, vast seagrass beds, and coastal mangrove forests. It is also a precious habitat for many wildlife species, including manatees, sea turtles, and seabirds. Nestled within the bay are several famous man-made islands, such as Palm Island, home to multi-million-dollar villas. With its calm, crystal-clear waters, the bay is an ideal paradise for water sports like kayaking and snorkeling. The moment the sun goes down, casting a vibrant orange-gold glow over the marinas, creates an incredibly romantic scenery. A modern system of causeways not only serves as an architectural highlight, but also perfectly connects mainland Miami to Miami Beach. Now, before we move on to the next destination, here's a fun question for you. Which Florida destination is famous for its 7-mile bridge? Comment your answer below. 5 small keys sit connected by bridges just south of St. Petersburg, and from above they look less like a park and more like a place the city forgot to develop. That's not entirely wrong. The U.S. Army built a coastal defense post on the main island in 1898, named it after the Spanish explorer who first mapped this coastline, and spent 2 decades preparing for an attack that never came. The guns were never fired in combat. By 1923, the military had walked away entirely, and Pinellas County bought the whole thing in 1948 for $26,500. What they got was 5 keys, miles of Gulf-facing beach, and water shallow enough to walk out 100 feet and still see the bottom. The sand here stays white and the water stays clear because there's no development on the barrier side, no runoff, nothing to cloud it. Over 328 species of birds have been recorded in the park, and during migration season, shorebirds work the flats in numbers that shift dramatically from one week to the next. The only way to reach the outer keys is by ferry from inside the park, and those islands run quieter still. The world is full of amazing places waiting to be discovered. Subscribe and let's explore them together. The sandbar at the island's tip never stays the same shape for long. Currents push it one way through the dry season and another during storms, so the white spit curling out into the Gulf today sits somewhere different than it did a few years back. Just behind it, a small lagoon cuts into the mangroves, calm enough that the water barely moves even when the open gulf beyond it has waves rolling in. 48 pairs of osprey nest in the slash pines further inland, some of the highest density found anywhere in North America, and a few of those pines are pushing 200 years old. That stand of trees is one of the last pieces of virgin pine forest left on this stretch of coast. From above, the shallows around the island run through every shade of green, sandbars rising close enough to the surface that boats slow down to read the water before crossing. The causeway connecting the island to Dunedin cuts straight through that same shallow water, with condo towers from Clearwater Beach visible on the horizon to the south. Sand keeps shifting along the north end too, exposed in pale patches at low tide, before the next current covers it over again. If you enjoyed this journey, you can support the channel with a small coffee hero. Your support helps me keep creating more travel videos like this. Thank you so much. Jupiter sits at the northern edge of Palm Beach County, where the Loxahatchee River cuts through to the Atlantic. The inlet it forms is the only place on Florida's east coast where a river meets the ocean this way. The waterway runs through the middle of town, and from above the whole place reads as a network of canals, docks, and waterfront homes. The Red Lighthouse at the inlet has been here since 1860, designed by an Army engineer named George Meade, who went on to defeat Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg a few years later. It still operates every night, one of only 13 lighthouses in the country still running a first-order Fresnel lens. Jupiter has stayed quieter than the communities to the south, with lower buildings, more tree cover, and a stretch of coastline that hasn't been fully built out. The Intracoastal Waterway runs along the western side of town, and on weekends, the drawbridge opens regularly for larger boats heading out through the inlet toward open water. The mangrove estuary behind the lighthouse is part of a 120-acre conservation area, one of the only units of the National Conservation Lands east of the Mississippi River. Harborside Place, the waterfront development at the river's edge, draws people in for dining and events without changing the overall scale of the town. The pier at the north end of this island has been knocked down by a hurricane before, long before anyone here had heard the name Ian. A storm took out the first one in 1944, and the county built a new one a few years later, right where Times Square stands today. That square became the heart of the island, a place where people came to fish off the end of the pier and grab something to eat afterward. In September of 2022, a Category 4 hurricane pushed water 15 feet high across the island and swallowed most of what stood along the shoreline, including that same stretch of beach. What's left now is a mix of empty lots, new construction, and stretches that already look the way they used to. The new pier going up is longer than the one that came before it, built to take whatever comes next. Crews have also been pumping fresh sand back onto the beach, more than 1 million tons of it, rebuilding the shoreline one section at a time. From above, the long curve of white sand and the bridge connecting the island to the mainland still draw boats into the marina every afternoon. Condo towers and waterfront homes line the bayside, where the water turns from teal to a deeper green the further out it goes. Estero Island runs about 7 miles end to end, and at low tide you can walk most of that distance without ever leaving the sand. Some restaurants reopened as food trucks first and only later moved into permanent buildings again. As the sun drops over the Gulf, the same pier pilings that survived the storm catch the last orange light before the island goes dark for the night. The wooden houses lining these streets weren't always meant to stand on land. For most of the 19th century, ships kept wrecking on the reefs just offshore, and the men who rowed out to save them got to keep whatever cargo they pulled from the wreck. That single rule turned salvage into the island's main business, and for a few decades it made Key West the wealthiest city in the country, person for person. Some of those salvagers were shipbuilders from the Bahamas, and they framed their new houses the same way they'd framed hulls, with wide porches and steep tin roofs built to shed heat and survive a storm. A lighthouse went up to warn ships away from the reefs, which should have ended the wrecking trade overnight. But the first one only lasted 20 years before a hurricane tore it down in 1846. The keeper's widow took over the job afterward and held it for more than 3 decades. Out past the harbor, the small island visible from the docks used to be a fuel depot built by the Navy during the Cold War, with tanks meant to hold enough to supply submarines passing through. Those plans never really worked out, and by the 1990s, the island had a new name and a new purpose, and someone had to ship in sand from the Bahamas because the real shoreline here is rock, not beach. The road that connects all of this to the rest of Florida runs on the bones of a railroad that a hurricane wiped out in 1935, and the longest stretch of it crosses almost 7 miles of open water without ever touching land. Is Key West one of the most beautiful islands in Florida? Comment 1 if you agree, or 2 if you know a better one. In 1921, a developer named Joseph Young bought 16,000 acres of Florida marshland and pine forest with a plan to build a city from scratch. He laid out wide boulevards, public parks, and beach access before a single hotel existed. By 1923, he had finished the promenade along the Atlantic, that would define the place for the next 100 years. Three years later, a hurricane hit and leveled much of what he had built, and the city went bankrupt. Hollywood rebuilt slowly, and the Broadwalk stayed. Today it runs 2.5 miles along the beach, 30 feet wide, with hotels, cafes, and rental shops lining the inland edge, and open sand on the other side. The Intracoastal Waterway runs parallel to the beach just a few blocks west, and from above the town reads as a narrow strip caught between two bodies of water. Hollywood sits exactly halfway between Miami and Fort Lauderdale, which has historically kept it out of the shadow of either. The Margaritaville Resort and the Diplomat anchor the northern stretch of beach, both visible from the water and drawing a crowd that fills the Broadwalk on weekends. Seven miles of beach run the full length of the city, and the southern end stays quieter than the stretch near the hotels. A quarter mile off the southern tip of this island, divers found a cemetery. It was a 7,000-year-old Native American burial site, sitting on what used to be dry land before sea levels rose and swallowed it. That discovery made Manasota Key the location of the first offshore prehistoric burial site ever found in the Americas. The island itself is about 11 miles long, Gulf on one side, Lemon Bay on the other, and it only became an island in the 20th century when the Intracoastal Waterway was cut through. Before that, it was a peninsula. The communities here grew slowly, mostly smaller homes passed down through families rather than developed all at once. In October 2024, Hurricane Milton changed that. Storm surge buried the roads and ground floors of most homes in sand, and some structures didn't survive it at all. Here shows both versions of the key, the damage still visible in places, and the beach still drawing people in despite it. Stump Pass Beach State Park anchors the southern end, a 245-acre preserve where the Gulf meets Lemon Bay, and the water shifts between two different shades of green, depending on which side you're standing on. The beaches here are known for fossilized shark teeth washing up along the shoreline, remnants of the same prehistoric seafloor that once covered this whole stretch of coast. Getting here means crossing the bridge from Englewood on the mainland, which also means the island has stayed quieter than the more connected stretches of Gulf Coast to the north. The water stays shallow and clear well past the shoreline. The sand here didn't start as sand. It started as quartz in the Appalachian Mountains, broken loose by rivers and carried south for thousands of years, until the current ground it down into something fine enough to squeak under your feet. That same quartz is the reason the water looks the way it does. Sunlight hits the white seafloor through shallow water and bounces back up through it, turning the Gulf into shades of green and turquoise that shift depending on the depth below the surface. For most of the 20th century, none of this was considered valuable. Beachfront land sat empty, covered in dunes that rose up to 100 feet in places, because nobody had figured out what to do with sand yet. The bridge connecting the beach to the mainland told the same story in a different way. It started as a low drawbridge in 1929, got replaced once in the 1950s as traffic outgrew it, and didn't reach its current form until 2003. Somewhere in between, the dunes started coming down and the condo towers started going up, and the beach stopped being empty land and became one of the most visited stretches of coastline on the Gulf. Today, the shoreline runs for miles without much of a break, white sand giving way to green water and then to the deeper blue further out. Piers stretch into the Gulf, where fishing has always drawn people out past the breakers. Carl Fisher had this entire island dredged and reshaped before any of these buildings went up. What he was working with was mostly mangrove and sandbar, barely above water, and not connected to the mainland by anything sturdier than a ferry. The bridge that finally linked it to Miami in 1913 ran 2.5 miles across the bay and was, for a while, the longest wooden bridge in the world. Within a decade, hotels lined the beach where swamp used to sit, and the city had a population large enough to support them. A hurricane in 1926 tore through and flattened most of what Fisher had built, and the rebuilding that followed is what actually produced the skyline people recognize today. Architects working with limited budgets during the Depression turned to a style heavy on rounded corners, pastel color, and concrete built to withstand storms, and by the 1930s, Ocean Drive and Collins Avenue were lined with it. That collection of buildings sat neglected for decades before preservationists fought to protect it, instead of letting it get torn down for high-rises. In 1979, the district was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and it remains the largest concentration of Art Deco architecture anywhere in the world. We gather info from many sources. If something seems off or you've got more to add, drop a comment. For most of its history, this stretch of sand could only be reached by boat. That changed in 1931 when the first bridge connected the island to the mainland, and a recreation complex went up almost overnight where the main beach sits today. People still call it Casino Beach, though there was never any gambling involved. It had a dance hall, bathhouses big enough for 500 people, and a pier stretching out into the Gulf. That building came down in 1972, but the wooden beams from its dance floor got pulled out and used again across town, in a courtyard that still stands. The pier here today runs nearly 1,500 feet into the Gulf, long enough that it held the record for the longest pier on this coast for years. Nobody actually owns the land under any of these buildings. The whole island was handed over by the federal government decades ago under a deal that only allows long-term leases. Out past the pier, the water shifts from pale green near the shore to a deeper emerald the further out it goes, a contrast that shows up clearly from above. Most afternoons in summer bring the same routine: paddleboarders drifting past the pilings, anglers casting from the railings, sunbathers spread out along the white sand. Naval jets from the base nearby cut low over the beach sometimes, practicing formations before the next air show. The ship carrying ironwork for this lighthouse never made it to shore. It sank 2 miles offshore in 1884, and divers had to be brought in from Key West just to recover the pieces before construction could even start. That same lighthouse still stands at the island's east end today, though Hurricane Ian snapped one of its iron legs in 2022 and tore apart the keeper's cottages around it. The light went dark for months before it was switched back on in February of 2023. Sanibel sits east to west instead of the usual north to south like most barrier islands nearby, and that single difference in orientation is the reason shells pile up here the way they do. Currents moving through the Gulf sweep shells against the island's long edge instead of past it, turning the beaches into a natural collection point that draws people hunched over at low tide searching the sand. Before 1963, the only way onto the island was a ferry running from the mainland, and that isolation is part of why so much of Sanibel still looks undeveloped. About a third of the island is set aside as a wildlife refuge, home to one of the country's largest undeveloped mangrove ecosystems. Bridges connect the island to the mainland now, carrying traffic past water that shifts from deep green to pale turquoise depending on the season. Kite surfers cut across the shallows near the point where the island narrows to a sandy tip. Inland, boardwalks run through the same mangrove cover the Calusa once depended on for food, long before any causeway existed. In May 1945, 7 activists waded into a whites-only beach in Miami to be arrested. County officials chose not to arrest them. Instead, within weeks, they opened a stretch of shoreline on Virginia Key as the only beach Black Miamians were legally permitted to use. For the first 2 years, the only way to get there was by boat. The Rickenbacker Causeway opened in 1947 and changed that, and the beach quickly became a gathering place. After desegregation ended its original purpose, the park declined and the city shut it down in the early 1980s. It sat closed for over 20 years before a community effort got it onto the National Register of Historic Places in 2002 and back open to the public in 2008. Today, Virginia Key holds that history alongside a large marina and a NOAA oceanographic research facility occupying the eastern end of the island. The Miami skyline sits directly across the bay, close enough to feel like part of the same place. Most of the island is still mangrove, which is the reason it looks the way it does from above. Before any bridge reached this island, the only way in was by steamship, and the dock that received those boats still stands at the north end today. It went up in 1911, built by a man named Charles Roser, who'd made his fortune from a cookie. He came up with the recipe for what eventually became the Fig Newton and sold it off before turning his attention to this stretch of sand. The pier he built ran nearly 800 feet into Tampa Bay, long enough to handle steamers coming over from Tampa and St. Petersburg. A bridge finally connected the island to the mainland in the early 1920s, and from there the place grew into 3 separate towns that still divide the island today, each with its own personality, but the same long stretch of beach running through all of them. White sand runs the length of the coastline here, broken only by docks and the occasional fishing pier, reaching out into water that shifts between turquoise and deep green, depending on the light. Boats still cut through the channels between the island and the mainland, the same routes those old steamers once used. Houses along the shore keep a low profile, rarely rising more than a few stories, which keeps the view of the Gulf open from nearly anywhere on the main road running down the island's spine. It looks like one place, but it's actually a string of islands connected by the overseas highway. Islamorada has been calling itself the sport fishing capital of the world long enough that the title has stuck. The density of fishing charters operating out of here is higher per square mile than anywhere else on Earth. The flats on the bay side are part of the reason. Shallow enough to wade in places, they hold bonefish and tarpon year-round, drawing anglers who fly in specifically for a single species. The Iron Lighthouse, standing 4 miles offshore, has its own story. In 1822, a Navy schooner sent to patrol for pirates ran aground on the reef and couldn't be freed. The crew stripped it of everything useful and set it on fire to keep pirates from claiming it. The reef took the ship's name, and when a lighthouse was built there in 1873 to warn other vessels, it took the name too. The structure was decommissioned in 2015, and a local community group has since raised $6 million to restore it. Along the bay side, hundreds of wading birds gather in the shallows at low tide. Spoonbills and herons spread across the flats in numbers that are visible from the air. This island and the one directly to its north were the same piece of land until 1921, when a hurricane cut straight through the middle and split them apart. The southern half became Caladesi. It stayed that way, undeveloped, while the rest of the Gulf Coast built up around it. A homesteader named Henry Scharrer settled here in the 1880s and lived on the island for decades, and before he died in 1934, he expressed his wish that the land be preserved rather than sold for development. Florida eventually bought it and made it a state park, which is the reason it still looks the way it does now. The only way in is by ferry from the neighboring island to the north, a 20-minute ride, and visits are capped at 4 hours. In 2008, Dr. Beach ranked it the best beach in the United States. The interior holds a 3-mile trail through old-growth pine and mangrove, and the bay side has a marina where private boats can dock overnight. The water moving through this marsh isn't really a swamp at all. It's a river, just one that's wide and shallow enough to look like grass from above. For most of its length, it moves so slowly that the current is barely visible, sheeting south from Lake Okeechobee toward the coast. That movement nearly stopped completely in 1928, when crews blasted through limestone to build a 2-lane highway straight across it. The road worked exactly as a dam would. A handful of culverts let some water through, but nowhere near what used to flow, and the marsh on the south side started drying out for the first time in its history. It took the better part of a century before anyone raised sections of that highway high enough to let the water move freely underneath again. Airboats showed up around the same era the road did, built independently by people who actually lived out here. The design has barely changed since. Alligators drift near the surface along the grass edges, mostly still, with just the eyes and the ridge of the back showing above the waterline. There is no dock here, no address, and nothing built on it. The Haulover Sandbar is a shallow rise in the floor of Biscayne Bay, visible only at low tide, and the only way to reach it is by boat. On weekends, 100 boats or more anchor there at once, rafted up close enough that people walk between decks. Yachts, speedboats, jet skis, sailboats, everything ends up in the same stretch of waist-deep water. The whole scene started informally in the 1980s when local boaters discovered the spot and began returning every weekend, and it has been growing since. The waterway leading out to it runs past some of the most expensive private waterfront in Miami. Getting there from most Miami marinas takes under 30 minutes. The name Haulover goes back to the 1880s, when a mail carrier had to haul his cargo overland across this narrow strip of land between the bay and the ocean. The inlet here was eventually cut in 1925, and it remains the only man-made opening in this stretch of coast between the two major shipping channels. The sandbar has no permanent form. Tides and storms shift it constantly. The barrier island, just offshore, used to be one continuous strip of land before a hurricane tore through in 1921 and split it into two. The break created a channel now called Hurricane Pass, and the northern piece sat mostly forgotten for years afterward. More than 150 couples had come to stay in thatched cottages built just for them. That's how Honeymoon Island got its name, and the causeway leading out to it still draws people across 2.5 miles of open water today. At one point, it had the largest fleet of sailing vessels anywhere in the state, with docks built specifically to handle ships too large for smaller ports nearby. That same stretch of water now holds a marina full of sailboats instead of cargo schooners, with downtown streets running just a block from the docks. A golf course on the edge of town has its own claim to history, having hosted national championship tournaments tied to the early days of professional golf in America. Boats still cut wakes across the sound between the mainland and the islands, the same route sailors have used for more than a century. Waterfront homes line the canals further south, each with its own dock reaching out into water that connects, eventually, back to the same gulf that split that island apart 100 years ago. In 1885, Tampa was a fishing village of fewer than 1,000 people with no railroad and no reason for anyone to notice it. That changed when a Cuban cigar manufacturer moved his operation here from Key West and started building houses for his workers on 40 acres northeast of downtown. Other factories followed. Within 20 years, the neighborhood they built was rolling 500 million cigars a year, and Tampa had grown from a village into a city. The cigar factories were quiet enough that workers hired readers to stand on the floor and read novels and newspapers aloud while everyone worked, a practice that lasted for decades. That history is still physically present in the city. The building with the silver minarets along the Hillsborough River was built in 1891 as a luxury hotel by the railroad baron who brought the first rail line to Tampa. It closed in 1930 and reopened 3 years later as the University of Tampa, and the minarets have been on the skyline ever since. The river itself runs through older residential neighborhoods before the downtown towers take over, and from above, the contrast between the two is sharper than most cities of this size. The waterfront holds the convention center, a marina, and the bay opening out behind it toward the causeway bridges that connect Tampa to the peninsula across the water. Tampa Bay is wide enough that on hazy days, the far shore disappears entirely. No other state touches two different seas the way Florida does, the Gulf on one side and the Atlantic on the other. That coastline runs longer than any other states in the country, stretching past the edge of what most people picture when they think of a beach. From hidden mangrove trails to the neon glow of Miami's shores, this peninsula keeps rewriting the meaning of paradise. The ocean is calling. Where will the Florida coast take you first?